Good morning. Welcome back to our 2013 Lenten Lectionary workshop. And whether you are with us here in the chapel or joining us from the live stream podcast, we're glad to have you with us. I am very pleased to introduce our workshop leader, Dr. Lee Butler. Dr. Butler is our professor of theology and psychology here at the seminary. You'll find more detailed information about his research and his publications in the material that you received for today's workshop. But I'll just add that he and I came to CTS in the same year, and I'm confident that you will find his workshop useful to you as you begin to prepare and study the Lenten lectionary text for this year. So please welcome Dr. Butler.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. I extend my greeting and welcome to you all, those here on campus and those joining us by live video streaming. Welcome to this Lenten Lectionary Workshop. We're here today with the hope of offering you some ideas for how you might approach the task of preaching and doing the work of ministry through the Lenten season. You will have time and opportunity to ask questions both here on campus, as well as those of you who are viewing by live streaming. And we welcome questions. In fact, that is how I work best, when you're asking your questions and we are actually engaged in conversation and learning together, learning from one another. I believe that those of you who are here, when you have a question, however, that you come to the mic. That way we all might hear, as well as those who are viewing through live video streaming. When workshops of this nature tend to be staffed, they're usually facilitated by a Bible scholar or a profoundly skilled preacher. And you come to these things because you want to hear the Bible scholar tell you the meaning of the text, to give you all the nuances that you can take back to your preaching moment and share these wonderful insights and these great lights that will help people, to have the preacher to give you these homiletical skills, these ways of actually communicating the text that will rouse your listener and also bring about profound transformation. This year, however, we're turning away from the typical. Today's workshop is being facilitated by a pastoral theologian who emphasizes the usage of the Bible, enjoys preaching, and advocates care of the souls in ministry. Pastoral theology, as I teach it, is an interdisciplinary field. It brings together three general fields of study: theology, psychology, and ministry. Theology, psychology, and ministry. The three come together as equal partners in the work of the pastoral theologian, in the work of doing these multiple and various ministries of pastoral care. Because each field has its own variety, pastoral theology approaches are multiplicitous. There is not a single way of doing pastoral theology, but many different ways of doing pastoral theology, all because of the ways that you integrate these various fields of theology, psychology, and ministry. There is also the very fact that each of the fields has a range within. There is not a single approach to theology. There's not a single approach to psychology, and we know that there are a variety of ways of entering into and engaging in ministry. You know, when I was coming of age within the church, I grew up with the understanding that there was only one valid ministry, pastoral, that unless you were a pastor, you weren't really doing ministry. Of course, I grew out of that and learned that there are many different ministries and all of them very important. My particular construction, which is important for us to know for our discussion today, my particular construction of pastoral theology is one that resources liberation theologies, not just one liberation theology, but the many varieties of liberation theologies, depth and developmental psychologies, and ministries of care. So these are the main categories of these different fields that I coordinate in doing pastoral theology. And I say it's important for you to know today because as we are engaging in conversation, you need to know where I'm coming from as I'm answering your questions. I emphasize the importance of praxis, context, and culture in my reflections on texts and community. Praxis, which is to be distinguished from practice. That is, I'm always encouraging people to be very conscious and conscientious about your engagement within a given situation, within a specific moment of ministry. That you're thinking about actively what's going on, and that you're reflecting on everything that's happening in the dialogue. That you might even take a moment to step back, to step away, to think about what's going on because you recognize that the situation is not typical, but something quite unique, and then you re-engage it. Perhaps changing what you thought you were talking about because you discovered that you were wrong about what the question was really asking, about what the statement was really communicating. And so praxis is all about action, reflection, and action, and reflection, and action again. Context, that every moment is brand new. And you have to consider the particularities, the sometimes peculiarities of where you are located, socially and emotionally. And you must always consider culture, that we each come from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, from different geographical regions, and each of these neighborhoods has its own flavor, its own way of engaging, its own history, its own stories that declare life, that speak to reality, that help us to interpret our location. So culture always has to be considered, that each moment presents a new intercultural moment, a new intercultural dialogue. So all of these go into my considerations, my reflections of both the text as Bible and the community. So today what you are getting is Butlerian hermeneutics. By day's end, by the end of today, we hope that you will have a few more resources for reflection, a few more strategies for considering context, and a few more hermeneutical keys for interpreting text. And that is the biblical text as well as people's lives as living human texts. That you have to hold both of these in tension, that you can't ignore either one, that you have to interpret the stories that you're given by the people that you are engaged in ministry with. Before moving forward, what do I mean when I say hermeneutical keys? Well, of course, hermeneutics is this process, practice, science, as it were, of interpretation. So we are constantly engaged in the act, the process of interpretation, interpreting everything, interpreting every conversation, interpreting every moment. We have walked into this space, been told it was a chapel, and we've interpreted it. Is it? What makes it? What makes it not? So we're constantly engaged in interpretation, but then we have to ask, what is the source, or what are the sources of our interpretation? And those are what I'm identifying as your keys, because we have different sources and resources for interpreting everything. For most of us, experience is one of our most fundamental keys for interpretation. We interpret through our experience. We come to understand what a person is sharing with us by virtue of how we process it through our own stories. We might have a psychological interpretation. We might have a sociological interpretation. We might have an existential interpretation. And each one of these will be hermeneutical keys. Keys for unlocking meaning. Your choice of key is what unlocks the door that stands between text and context, between what you're reading in the Bible and the biblical context, as well as your current context of ministry, your contemporary moment and experience in life. The hermeneutical keys allows you to see both spaces and walk between and within both spaces. And as you are beginning to identify your hermeneutical keys and you're applying them to text and context, I encourage you to allow your creativity to lead the way in this process of interpretation. Why? Because if the Spirit is truly involved in your act, in the process of interpretation, and we are being led by the Spirit, we must recognize that the Spirit is very creative. And so if you're going to be able to really excavate the meaning, you have to allow your creativity to help you to move the earth, as it were, to move the ground of your being. Allow your creativity to lead in your process of interpretation. To give you an example of this, and some of the things I've said thus far: context, text, culture, human lives, experience, story, creativity. I want you to focus your attention for the moment on not one of our lectionary texts, but on the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, chapter 2. And this is one of the creation narratives. It's a text that is very familiar to many of us. And it declares what God did step by step in the creation of all that there is. It further declares how God created humanity and breathed into the form that had been molded from the dust of the earth, breathed into this form, this inanimate, breathed into this one, the breath of life, God's own being, and the form became a living being. As I said, it's a text that we know very well. And now I would like to actually read to us a poem that is a retelling of this very familiar text. It's a poem by James Weldon Johnson. And he has taken the sermons that he's heard preached and the testimonies that he's heard declared in the life of the congregation and his own creative sensibilities, as well as the stories of a culture, and he retells this story of creation within the heritage of the African American. The poem is entitled "The Creation." And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, "I'm lonely. I'll make me a world." And far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke. The darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other, and God said, "That's good." Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun. And he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it into a shining ball and flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and stars. Then down between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world, and God said, "That's good." Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand and the moon on his left. The stars were clustered around his head, and the earth was under his feet, and God walked. And where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. Then he stopped and looked and saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over the edge of the world, and he spat out the 7 seas. He batted his eyes, and the lightning flashed. He clapped his hands, and the thunder rolled, and the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed. The pine trees pointed his finger to the skies, and the oak spread out his arms. The lakes cuddled down in the hollow of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea. And God smiled again, and the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulders. Then God raised his arm and waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, "Bring forth, bring forth." And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowl and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forest and the woods, split the air with their wings. And God said, "That's good." Then God walked around, and God looked around on all that he made. He looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars, and he looked on his world with all its living things. And God said, "I'm lonely still." Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down with his hand in his hands. God thought and thought till he thought, "I'll make me a man." Up from the riverbed, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river, he kneeled down. And there, the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand. This great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he blew the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Amen. And so from this poem, this sermon, we have a text that has been, through creativity, reframed, given new life, given meaning for a people in the context of their own story, using a language that they understand, using the symbols that represent their being. And so this is the kind of creativity that I encourage within you as you engage these texts. Sometimes the Lenten preaching moment becomes an acknowledgement of the then, where the now results in pulling people into the text in an over-spiritualized way that ignores the memories, the messiness, the pain, and the suffering that people are experiencing in the now. That we just have this tendency of pulling people out of their situations and dropping them into the text and telling them it's going to be okay because you're in the text. But we don't bring about transformation by escaping our situations. We bring about transformation because we choose to wrestle with what God is saying about our current circumstances. We don't want to advocate escapism. Rather, we want to advocate transformation through confrontation. So, the first emphasis of the day is for you to be willing to walk in the different places where you have not walked before.
And sitting in church, really rarely preaching, but sitting in observation. Do we ever look for a certain outcome of all of the disciplines that we are presenting to them? I mean, where are we going with what we're doing? I mean, I understand what you're saying, but what is the church supposed to do when they hear messages? Are they supposed to I mean, it seems like to me sometimes, I'm not being fatalistic, but I'm just saying sometimes they just don't seem to hear. But they keep going on and on the same way. What is the outcome? Do you put down, I want my church to do this? Or do you just say, well, we'll leave it up to God, I hope they hear it. I hope they do something, you know.
Well, that is probably one of the purposes. I mean, you're talking about education and outcome. That's one of the purposes of theological education, and what we as educators within theological institutions are hoping to transmit, that change is possible, that we are encouraging students of theology to take theology seriously, and all the other skills that we are attempting to share with students, to take it into ministry, because we want the church, we want people's lives to be changed. But what are we battling against, even as we're saying we want people's lives to be changed? We're battling against people. And what I mean by that is our nature as human beings is to have life be predictable, safe, secure, which often means nothing changes. I'm most comfortable when I know exactly is going to happen next. So we love living in our comfort zones. And when we are pushed out of our comfort zones, we do everything we can to get back into our comfort zones. And so the hope is that we will, as leaders within the church, that we will disrupt enough that folks get shaken out of their complacency, and that while they are out of their complacency, that we will work with them in such a way that we will help them to create a new way of being and not regress into the old. And so, yes, we recognize that it's not easy, that people seem not to hear, but that's why we continue to preach week after week after week, while we continue to teach week after week after week, while we continue to engage in other aspects of ministry, of care and counseling and service, all in an effort to help a person to be reframed and restored. That it's not just one thing that brings about transformation, but that we have to move within every aspect of a person's life, addressing every aspect of their being, of seeking to highlight, to unearth, to expose, to bring glory to what it means to live in community, and to help folks to learn how to live comfortably with themselves and with others. We have all of the rhetoric. We just need to help some folks, all of us actually, learn how to live the rhetoric. I'm not what I used to be, but I'm not all I'm going to be. We have all the rhetoric. And it's a matter of helping folks to live it. Sometimes it's helping them to even listen more carefully to what they're saying. Because we'll say things, not paying attention to what we just said, and we could be speaking the most profound truths. And just getting a person to listen to their own voice sometimes helps to bring about the change that's necessary. Helping a church to see beyond their own walls, to recognize that there is more to life than the story that they have sought to preserve. So that you might have a situation, a pastor of a church that is very seasoned. We'll say one of the churches that's more than 100 years old. And there might be a movement within the ministry that says we need to do some different things. We need to engage things differently. We need to begin to make the gospel come alive in new ways and new spaces and new places. And you'll have those voices that say, well, what's the problem here? We've been doing this for 100 years. We must have been doing something right. But we also have a biblical record that says that God has been wrestling with us for more than 100 years to move us along. And so if we can get folks to live life, not to have this notion of we are at the end point, but that living life is constantly evolving, changing, growing, moving, transitioning. It's the educational process.
You mentioned a moment ago that we should help people to be comfortable in their community, but it seems to me that what you're saying is we really should help people be uncomfortable, to help them cope with lack of comfort with change, which is not comfortable. Because if we are going to that moment of discernment and that moment of transformation, it's painful and it's changing. And so I think rather we need to be there to help them in their discomfort, if that's a word.
Yes, and I think it's both. Of course, we do have this idea of making the comfortable uncomfortable to move them out. But there's also, I think, looking at this idea that while we want to advocate community, most of us have a peculiar definition of that, and it often is foreign to actually living together. That we come together, but we are so afraid of one another that we are not really disclosing who we are, what we feel, because we don't feel that this place that is identified as my community really is a safe place to be all that I am. And so I think it's both. There is this important need of disrupting so that folks will move out of their complacency. But there's also the need to recognize that just because they gather doesn't mean that they're feeling safe. Even though folks will be members of the church and they will go week after week after week and not really feel that that space is a safe place for them to be, but they have a sensibility, a feeling in the spirit that says, nevertheless, this is the right place to be because it is the place where I can hear God.
Thank you. I think that discernment is something that is a word that we are accustomed to in theological settings, but I'm not sure that all of our congregants really understand the nature of discernment. And I think that, to your point about discomfort, I think that reflection is difficult at best, and how can we just kind of tease open the beginning of what reflection might and discernment might look like to people who are very uncomfortable with it.
Yes, indeed. I think one approach, and it's probably not a very difficult approach, if you begin to frame discernment as one of the spiritual disciplines, I think that will help. And I'm saying it's not a difficult approach because we're living in an age where spirituality is something that folks appreciate. It is the language of the everyday now. We find lots of folks who will say, I'm spiritual, not religious. So if you begin to identify discernment as one of the spiritual disciplines that is a part of what it means to engage in spirituality, I think that they will then begin to be more open to engaging in these processes that help them to explore meaning, that helps them to search out truth. Spirituality being a process that helps us to become whole and integrates us and improves our relationships with others as well as with the divine spirit. If discernment is a part of that integration process of how do I learn who I am and how to be in better relationship with another, if that begins to be identified as discernment, it becomes more acceptable. And once we are open to the Spirit leads. Other questions? Okay. So we push ahead Again, focusing on Lent, its meaning, grounding it in the story of Jesus' experience. Jesus and his fast and his temptations reflect a tumultuous time in his life. I therefore encourage us to examine the tumult of our present times and seek to discern what more we can do and inspire others to do. That we not turn away from the pain and the suffering of the everyday, that we clearly recognize the tumult of our present age, and we seek to understand, to discern, to inspire others to do more, that we begin to do more. And I think that even our lectionary texts are encouraging this. They're calling for this. They are hopefully inspiring this within us. So we look at the first reading, the Ash Wednesday reading, and the prophet Isaiah, chapter 58, and verses 1 through 12. Now, we're not going to walk through every single lectionary text, but I'm going to highlight some, and I want to lift up this one, and then this afternoon, we're going to go through all the text of one of the weeks. But this Isaiah 58, verses 1 through 12. Shout out. Do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinances of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose? A day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? And so this portion of the text clearly challenges what it means to fast and how we engage in the fast. And if we are fasting and not paying attention to what we are doing to others, to how others are living, then the fast becomes selfishness, foolishness, a waste of time, and it only is about puffing yourself up and has nothing to do with God. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and to not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and God will say, "Here am I." And so just as we pointed out, here was what Jesus was really wrestling with, what the temptation was really about in terms of his own process of discernment and his determination that he would not engage in a ministry of selfishness, but one that was focused on service, of giving to others, of helping others to be restored to life. We find in the prophet this proclamation that it is really about engaging in helping to transform lives, to address the suffering that people are experiencing, that we are not to be overlooking injustice, that we are actually to be engaged actively in bringing about the new age, in bringing about a better world for people to live in. And so as we are engaged in Lent, we are to be reflecting, as I suggested earlier, what can I do? What more can I do? What ought I to be involved in when I look around at all that is going on? Can I ignore those things in the name of being spiritual, in the name of living in the world and not being of the world? I'm not touching that. Is that what will please God? If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall rise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. If you engage your work of active engagement to bring about the restoration, the elevation, the recreation, will be blessed. And in being transformed, changed, everything becoming new, you will experience, and others will witness with their own eyes, the blessing of God's presence. And so in this season, on this beginning of the season, we are encouraged to do a new thing. To not do it the old way, not do it the selfish way, but to engage in ministries of change. More questions? Do we have questions from, do we have questions from those who are streaming? I know they were supposed to be twittering in. Okay.
I have a question about something you said much earlier. You started to mention the preconditions for transformation, and I wonder if you wanted to share more of those or unpack those a little bit more. I think they point to your question as well.
Well, that was more of a suggestion and encouragement, actually, more of an encouragement that you begin to consider that you raised the question, what are some of the preconditions for a person to be changed? We can look through the record, the biblical text, and look at folks whose lives were changed. Look at those folks who were declared to have received salvation. Today, salvation comes to your house. What was going on that allowed them to experience that moment as a moment of change, as a new moment? We have Paul's conversion from Saul to Paul. And he's struck down on the road to Damascus, and he is confronted with all that he had been doing and what he now must do because his eyes have seen the Lord, even as there was sight taken away. So we ask, what was it that prepared him to actually see the Lord? There had to be some things going on that brought him to that moment where he was now ready to be confronted. I mean, given all that he was doing, you're saying that the Lord couldn't have spoken to him earlier? So what was it that had to prepare him to say, okay, I'm in a position where everything can be broken out and all things can be made new within me? We like pointing to the fact that he witnessed the stoning of Stephen. And that's what brought him to that moment of now being changed. That was his most prominent precondition. An experience that allowed him to even discern, to seek to discern the Spirit of God in a different way. I mentioned as we looked at the Matthew text and Jesus' fasting and temptation, that there is possibly, or a possibility, that it was the death of his earthly father that then caused him. That was his precondition, that it was this profound loss that could have been a consuming grief that caused him to search, and now he was ready to be transformed. What we do in ministry is not only should we be attentive to the movements and the moments within the lives of the people that we serve in ministry, so that we are so sensitive to them that we recognize that there's a stirring within them that we can address. But sometimes, as has already been pointed out, we have to provoke in such a way that we put folks in crisis. And that's what becomes the precondition for their transformation. Raising the right questions, presenting them with the appropriate issues at the right moment, but always aware through observation and through relationship, always aware that you are working with another soul, another human being that requires your sensitivity, requires your love. We know, speaking more about some of the preconditions, we know, by way of pastoral care, I'm always telling you, those of you who have me in class, I'm always speaking that there are crises that we are constantly experiencing, and we have to be aware of the normal and predictable crises that accompany human existence, that accompany life. We just know that there are some crises that are going to happen. We know that babies are going to be born. That's a crisis. We know that some babies are going to make their transition early. Crisis. We know that folks are going to get married. That's a crisis. Trying to bring together two households and two lives and negotiating those wedding details where families become more demanding, where we've been socialized that it has to look a certain way, and feelings can be bruised at that time. Crisis. We know that people are going to lose their jobs. Crisis. We know that people are going to have to move away from home because of employment. Crisis. I mean, the list goes on where we just know these things are going to happen because they're a normal part of the maturation process. They're a normal part of just being alive. Normal, predictable. But these moments of crisis can also be moments of great beauty, because it's in the crisis that something new can come forth, that we can become new people out of the crisis. The first one I mentioned, children are going to be born. Children change you. We become new people because of our caring for the children, because of the ways we have been and will continue to be confronted by their own maturation process, where that little one that we loved so much and thought was so cute becomes this tall and has a mind that's different from that one, and certainly different from mine. That relationship causes all of us to grow. So there are conditions, there are preconditions, there are opportunities for transformation, for change, for salvation. Do we have any final? Yes.
Crisis of life-threatening illness, the crisis of violence can be perhaps among those. You mentioned life events, which often can be very joyful, then crisis that many of us, all of us to some extent, have experienced crisis of violence.
Absolutely. And that's actually the very next topic on my sheets.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Lent, read it again. Lent is often a personal discipline.
But is very public. How do we address the public life?
How do we address the public life given the personal influences, the first personal dimensions of Lent? Well, first, I don't want to ignore the personal dimensions of Lent because they are profoundly important, because we know that God does speak to us individually. We grow because of our conversations with God. That is a part of what it means to be actively involved in prayer, to have a prayer life, which is divine communication. And if Lent is encouraging us to be more prayerful, to go on an internal search, it is individual, but it is also one of the spiritual disciplines of the church that can help create community. So that we gather together and we are given opportunity to voice what we are learning through this season, what we are learning through these individualized disciplines, what we are encouraged to do because of our meditations and reflections. So that in this way, if we don't have testimony during Lent, it will remain individual. Because it's in the gathering of the community where we hear the experiences of one another, where I'm able to share with you, here is what emerged from my reflection, from my meditation, and now that which was individual becomes something for the whole community, where we can all now take hold of that vision, where we might even discover that, I was given that same message. So it wasn't just God speaking to me alone. God gave you the message. God is speaking to now all of us, making this individual experience a communal experience. So that's one way that Lent can become more expansive, that it can become more transforming of the whole. But from our Isaiah text, it's also encouraging us not to be so focused on our own transformation that we ignore the larger community. That we not hold this dichotomous understanding that church is separate from community and community is separate from church, but they are one in the same. And so it's not just what I do on this corner with this banner that flies that names my congregation, but it's also what happens outside of this congregation in the lives of the persons who live around that church community, that church building, those church members, that you are actually affecting everyone in the name of community. So it is the both and. The small, the large, the individual, the collective. And every story matters. Okay. Then according to the schedule, we are now at lunchtime. Joe walked in, Joe walked out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler. We will continue with the discussion after lunch. Those of you who are watching us online, you have a chance to have a break. We cannot stream you lunch, but just remember, whatever you have, it's not the Last Supper. Okay. Are we now?